Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. We're going to break down a situation that feels like it literally unfolded in the blink of an eye, but man, it carries consequences that could last for decades. We're looking at how a shocking border breach in a tiny Spanish city is suddenly threatening to blow up one of Europe's most sacred rules. Think about this. In one single night, tens of thousands of people crossed a border that is normally one of the most heavily guarded in the entire world. We're talking people swimming across open water, others scaling towering fences. And by morning, a small territory located right on the coast of Africa looked, well, kind of like a war zone. Burned vehicles, completely overwhelmed hospitals, and soldiers patrolling the streets. Within just 48 hours, the fallout from this one event spread way beyond Spain, hitting the absolute highest levels of European diplomacy. So to really grasp the magnitude of what's happening here, we are going to look at the immediate crisis, why Ceuta is uniquely positioned, the diplomatic fallout, the threat to Schengen, and finally, what happens next. All right, Section 1, the immediate crisis, chaos at the border. So late Wednesday night, July 29th, the situation on the ground became absolutely surreal. Massive groups of people, mostly young men, but also entire families, women, children, just moved around the coastal barriers and right onto roads inside the territory. Local workers were describing utter chaos. You had unaccompanied children literally sleeping in public parks, and the reinforcements that were sent in, they were entirely focused on just treating the injured rather than managing any sort of broader border control. To really grasp the sheer scale of this event, let's look at one number, 60,000. Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez visited the area and confirmed that roughly 60,000 people entered the city in just a few days. Now, let's put that into perspective, right? That figure is equal to more than half of Ceuta's entire population. Practically overnight, a city with a population in the tens of thousands had to absorb a massive, unprecedented surge of new arrivals. This kind of sudden population spike, it puts an unbearable strain on everything: housing, medical care, food, basic infrastructure. Those resources simply were not built to expand that fast. No way. But, beyond the logistical strain, there's a very heavy human toll here. Tragically, local officials reported at least 34 deaths. Many of these fatalities happened as people literally drowned attempting this incredibly dangerous crossing by sea. Others, tragically, were caught in a deadly crush near a breakwater fence close to Tarjal Beach. And even after the main crossing points were finally blocked off, the desperation just didn't stop. Groups kept moving along the coastline, desperately looking for other ways in, with some even preparing to swim around the barriers entirely. What is truly staggering here is just how rapidly the situation escalated over a super tight 48-hour window. On Wednesday, July 29th, a smaller surge of migrants began attempting to swim into Ceuta from the Moroccan side. But by Thursday, the situation absolutely exploded. Thousands crossed by land and sea, forcing Spain to announce it was sending in the armed forces to back up the police and the civil guard. And then by Friday, with the death toll rising, the crisis had already escalated to the international stage, with Italy actually threatening the core of European free travel. Moving on to Section 2. Why Ceuta? It's a geographic anomaly. To understand why this matters globally, we have to look at the history of this highly unique location. You see, when European countries gave up their African colonies in the 20th century, Ceuta, along with another city called Melilla, were the exceptions. Ceuta actually first came under Portuguese control all the way back in 1415. It became part of Spain in 1580, and well, it has stayed under Spanish rule ever since. And that history really brings us to the core paradox of Ceuta. It functions as one of only 2 European land borders on the entire African continent. So physically, you are standing on mainland Africa, surrounded by Morocco. But legally, you are completely on Spanish territory. You're literally standing at the external border of the European Union, protected by permanent security forces, high fences, heavy surveillance, the whole shebang. Because of this bizarre legal reality, Ceuta has long been one of the primary entry points for people trying to reach Europe from Africa. So you're probably asking, why did this happen right now? Well, officials were caught completely off guard, mostly because heading into this event, illegal immigration into Spain had actually dropped by about 40% over the previous year. But Spanish officials tied this sudden surge to a recent Supreme Court ruling in Spain that restricts authorities from immediately sending back migrants intercepted at sea without due process. That heavily complicated Spain's immediate response. And look, while Ceuta has seen surges before, like there was one back in 2021 when 10,000 migrants entered over 2 days, this current event of 60,000 completely dwarfs those previous records. It just entirely overwhelmed the local infrastructure. Which brings us to Section 3. The diplomatic fallout, political shockwaves. Because a border breach of this magnitude, it absolutely doesn't stay local for long. It almost instantly became a massive political flashpoint. Domestically, the crisis sparked immediate intense polarization. It really gives us a perfect snapshot of a divided political landscape right ahead of the upcoming Spanish elections. You've got Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez pledging to defend Ceuta as if it were Madrid. Meanwhile, Ceuta's president, Juan Jesus Vivas, called it an absolute humanitarian emergency, basically pleading for Madrid to step in. On the opposition side, the People's Party leader Alberto Núñez Feijóo framed it as a national security crisis. And then Santiago Abascal, leader of the Vox Party, went as far as labeling the crossings an invasion. So you can see how this single event is being leveraged across the entire political spectrum to shape the conversation heading into an election. All right, Section 4, the Schengen threat, Europe divided. And this right here is where a local Spanish border breach suddenly becomes a major continental issue. The crucial flashpoint here is the Schengen Agreement. If you're not familiar, this is the absolute bedrock of European free movement, the agreement that lets people move between most European countries without passport checks. This system of open borders is exactly what Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni threatened to suspend in response to the crisis in Ceuta. That signals a massive, massive crack in European unity. Italy really escalated the rhetoric here. Take a look at the statement from Italy's Deputy Prime Minister Antonio Tajani. He stated publicly that Italy supports a full suspension of the Schengen Agreement with Spain due to its immigration policies. Basically, Italy used the acute crisis in Ceuta to publicly and aggressively criticize Spain's broader handling of migration, essentially threatening to just cut Spain off from the rest of Europe's open borders. Huge deal. But, as you might expect, there was immediate pushback from the top levels of the EU. Former EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell responded with this incredibly blunt statement. He pointed out that EU law does not allow any single member state to unilaterally suspend another. He flat out called the very idea legally non-existent. This highlights a really intense institutional clash, framing Italy's threat as a deliberate attempt to sort of stretch EU rules just to push a specific political narrative during a crisis. And this tension isn't just heated rhetoric, it's having real-world consequences right now. The ripple effect quickly reached France, and they took practical action to tighten their own physical border checks with Spain in direct response to the Ceuta crisis. When neighboring countries start throwing up physical checks like that, you can really see how quickly the dominoes of the open border system begin to wobble. Finally, Section 5. What happens next? The future of open borders. Is this just a temporary stress test, or are we looking at a permanent shift? Right now, the situation is incredibly fluid. We're really looking at 3 developing steps. Step 1 involves some very tricky, high-stakes repatriation negotiations between Spain and Morocco. Step 2 requires Spain to figure out how to address those legal hurdles created by their own Supreme Court ruling, the one that slowed down immediate returns at sea. And Step 3, that's watching Italy closely, because even if Italy can't legally kick Spain out of Schengen, they might try to leverage narrow security loopholes to enforce temporary border checks anyway. The framework technically allows for that if a nation argues there's a serious immediate security threat. Ultimately, what happened in Ceuta is a massive stress test for how Europe handles crises, cooperation, and disagreement all at once. The fact that a G7 nation is publicly floating the suspension of a member state leaves us with one incredibly provocative question. Will Schengen survive? I mean, how fragile is Europe's open border consensus under the immense weight of modern migration pressures? A tiny city on the coast of Africa just shook the entire foundation of Europe. Whether this becomes a permanent turning point for EU policy or just another tense chapter in a decades-long pattern is something we are going to be watching very, very closely. Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and I really encourage you to keep questioning how these hyperlocal events can completely reshape our global reality.